Ladies and gentlemen, we have been suffering from the scourge of addiction in our lives for decades. Addiction to drugs, addiction to alcohol, addiction to cigarettes, and worse, addiction to Instagram. Addiction runs rampant in our lives. And for so long it seemed like a mountain that would never be climbed over, it would never be conquered. But ladies and gentlemen, there is a breakthrough. A revolution in science spawning from the hotbed of tech in the world, Silicon Valley. And that cure, ladies and gentlemen, that cure is the dopamine detox. That is right, the dopamine detox. With just 2 applications of a dopamine detox every single year, addiction can be a thing of the past. Depression, gone. Lack of motivation, gone. With a dopamine detox, I guarantee that you can become the man or the woman that you always knew that you could become. So don't delay. Start your dopamine detox today and become the person you've always known that you can be. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about a self-help fad that spread from Silicon Valley itself. Silicon Valley, of course, being well known for having some of the smartest people in the world living there, who also seem to come up with some really dumb ideas. And one of those really dumb ideas is the dopamine detox. So in this video today, we're going to be talking about, do dopamine detoxes work? And if not, why? And also, what can we do about it? But you may be asking yourself, Ben, what is a dopamine detox? And I am more than happy to explain. Dopamine fasting is a lifestyle trend popular in the world's tech center, Silicon Valley, which involves cutting yourself off from almost all stimulation for 24 hours. You can't eat or drink anything apart from water, or use the internet, your phone, your computer or TV, or any other screens or technology during this time. You also can't listen to music or radio, have sex or masturbate, and you are encouraged to keep reading and talking to a minimum. Or in other words, it's a period of time where you initiate the laziest punishment of all time and you ground yourself for a day. Now, as always, you're probably wondering what makes me qualified to talk on the subject of dopamine fasting, and I ask you to refer to the pile of books that I have on my table to make me look much smarter than I actually am. And now that I've explained exactly what a dopamine fast is, you might be asking yourself, well, why would someone do a dopamine fast? And I'm more than happy to explain that as well. You see, practitioners believe that we are overloaded by things like social media, screen time, TV, and all this other media that gives us a lovely dopamine boost every single time we're exposed to it. And because we get so many of these dopamine hits, they believe that we are becoming eventually quite numb to dopamine. And they believe that by taking a break from pleasurable things, that we can actually reset the brain and reset our levels of dopamine. And in doing so, we can become more focused and more productive than ever before when we go back to regular life. And of course, during this time, there's only a few things that you can do, because the idea is to restrict the amount of dopamine that your brain releases. And so during this time, you are only allowed to go for walks in nature, meditate, write in a journal, drink water, and reflect on why your life choices have led you to where you are right now, doing a dopamine fast. Essentially, it is Lent, but on a weird cocktail of methamphetamine and steroids. And the dopamine fast is supposedly meant to completely reset your brain and start the process of resetting your dopamine receptors. And of course, if you've made it all the way through to this point in the video and you don't know what dopamine is, Here's the brief sciencey explanation. Dopamine is a hormone and a neurotransmitter that plays several important roles in the brain and body. Dopamine is described by most as the pleasure chemical, or the reward chemical in some cases. But according to Professor Kim Hellemans, who's a neuroscience researcher at Carleton University in Canada, dopamine is also involved in much more than pleasure. It's involved in both eating behaviours and stress responses, and it is a signal that seems to be released when the organism needs to pay attention and learn about the signals in the environment that are motivationally relevant. But for now, we're going to ignore all of that and just go with the most basic explanation of what dopamine is, because that is what everyone uses to justify a dopamine fast, and that is that dopamine is the pleasure and reward chemical. Basically, when you do something fun, your brain releases dopamine and you feel good about it, and you do it again and again and again and again and again. And of course, depending on who you talk to, there are many benefits to doing a dopamine detox. Some people say that it can help with addiction to things like social media and screen time and pornography and a whole lot more. Others say that it is effective in treating depression, even though dopamine and depression have very little to link it together. But we'll get to more of that in just a minute. And others say that it completely resets your motivation through something called starving the donkey, which of course sounds very cruel. Let's just feed and respect our donkeys. I can't watch any more of those really sad donkey adverts on the TV. Let's just treat them with respect. Now, with all of that in mind, this of course brings us to what actually is the problem with a dopamine detox? Ben, why are you so annoyed at this? And I will tell you, there are 5 things that I believe are wrong with the dopamine detox based on the research that I've done into it and what neuroscientists, psychologists and other professionals have been saying about it. Now, number 1, there's actually no way for you to measure what levels of dopamine you have in your brain at any one time, because everyone's brain chemistry is different, and it's also ridiculously difficult to measure dopamine in the brain. You have to extract blood and then use some very complicated blood plasma removing technology. I don't understand how it works. I'm not nearly smart enough to understand how it works, but it's very complicated, and an industrial centrifuge is probably not something that all of us have lying around between the chopping board and the colander in the kitchen. It's just not something that we all have. And the first principle of any kind of treatment is know what you're treating and make sure what you are measuring is what you are measuring. And since we can't know what levels of dopamine we have in our brain at any time, then a dopamine fast or a dopamine detox might actually be completely meaningless. Which is something that is actually made reference in this clip right here and is never really actually addressed.
It'd be boring for a while.
But how do you know when it's too much? Like at what point can you draw the line and say, I think my dopamine levels are all off, or where do you decide that you need this?
There are different levels of dopamine related activities. So some things like social media we know now are highly addicting. They really bring us coming back a lot. And so the important thing about dopamine fasting is to find for you how long or what you can do to cut out some of these really compelling activities, but still find things that are still engaging for you.
How do we actually know when it is time for a dopamine detox? When do we know that our brains are overstimulated and that we are becoming numb to dopamine? We just don't know. No one can know without extremely complex tech. Now, number 2 is that we actually don't have a way to reliably interfere with our dopamine levels in a significant way in this kind of time frame, because bear in mind a dopamine detox is only meant to last typically 24 to 48 hours, mainly because you're abstaining from food, and over that period of time it can become quite dangerous, especially if you're somebody who suffers from diabetes or any kind of illness like that. But there really is no way to reliably do this in a natural way without some kind of drug intervention. And one of the main reasons for that is that dopamine isn't exactly what it seems to say in all of the dopamine detox guides. It's usually referred to as the pleasure or the reward chemical, but in reality it's a little bit more complicated than that, and dopamine seems to be largely responsible for something called motivational salience. And I'll just put up another brief sciencey alert now while I read verbatim from the Wikipedia page once again to make myself seem a lot smarter than I actually am. Motivational salience is a cognitive process and a form of attention that motivates or propels an individual's behaviour towards or away from a particular object, perceived event or outcome. Basically, dopamine, in my understanding of it, is more to help you learn what it is that is most important to do. So it can really help you to understand how much time and energy you need to put into something, whether or not a goal is actually important to you based on how good you feel about it. It's a lot more complicated than I switch on my phone, I go onto Instagram and, dopamine. There's a lot more to it than that, which is one of the reasons that the dopamine detox to me doesn't really stand up to scientific scrutiny. And since this is the case, then just cutting yourself off from pleasure and reward might not actually do anything for you, because there is so much more that dopamine is responsible for. For example, learning. Plus, there are plenty of people who find things like meditation, walks in nature and drinking water quite pleasurable, and of course I have to give a massive shout out to the r/HydroHomies subreddit. Now, number 3, and this is one that's more of an opinion than anything else, but fasts don't work most of the time for most people. Let's think about it. If you wanted to lose weight very, very quickly, an easy way to do that is just stop eating, and those pounds will shed pretty quickly. But do you know what is the big problem with that? It's a miserable, miserable existence, and also quite dangerous for you. But we'll put that aside because it doesn't quite work in this analogy. We all know that the best way to diet, or the best way to follow a meal plan or an exercise plan, is to find one that's actually fun for you, and that way you're actually using dopamine to your advantage. Fasting is hardly ever the best way to achieve some kind of result, unless perhaps it's some kind of political statement, in which case I won't get involved in that. Now, number 4 is that the dopamine detox seems to be roughly based on a theory in psychology and neuroscience called chemical imbalance theory, and this was the prevailing understanding of mental health issues for such a long time. The idea that things like depression and schizophrenia and anxiety are caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, and that was where a lot of the drug interventions came from. So if somebody is lacking serotonin, which is leading to depression, then give them a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, try saying that 3 times fast, and that will solve the problem. Except once people started actually thinking about it, we started to understand that maybe a lack of serotonin isn't causing depression, maybe depression is causing a lack of serotonin. And so there was an issue of cause and effect, and with the dopamine detox there is very much an issue of cause and effect here, because it may very well be that if you are having an addiction to your smartphone or to porn or to social media, that is being caused by a lack of dopamine. But on the other hand, it could be that addiction to those things is creating a lack of dopamine in your brain. So you've got an issue of cause and effect, which means that just by increasing the levels of dopamine, you might not actually solve the underlying problem. And of course, number 5, and this is my main point with the dopamine detox, is what happens next. Well, you ride the motivational high for a little while, and then eventually you just go back into your main life. Now, bearing in mind that a lot of this is based on the idea that we're addicted to things like social media and smartphones and porn and things like that, you can kind of see where the issue is, because the prevailing science is now saying that these things are addictive, even though they've not been classified as addictions in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, basically the book of every kind of mental health issue that can be diagnosed. But these things, we know that video games, we know that social media, we know that pornography is addictive. But with dopamine fasting, eventually you just reset back to where you were before. You go on your detox for 24 to 48 hours, and then after that, you kind of just go back to your old life. And if this was a drug addiction, this will be the equivalent of going to rehab for 2 days and then coming back and jumping headlong into a Scarface-sized pile of cocaine. You see why this starts to become a little bit ridiculous the more you look into it and the more you think about it. Like it or not, we always tend to revert back to our baseline regardless of positive or negative changes in our life. This is something that's called hedonic adaptation, which is the observed tendency of humans to quickly return to a relatively stable level of happiness despite major positive or negative events or life changes. Now, with all that in mind, we probably need to have a more serious discussion on addiction, because the practitioners of the dopamine detox are correct in saying that social media, video games, things like that are addictive behaviors. As I've already said, it's so important that we actually deal with these in an effective way because they are a legitimate addiction. However, the things that I've already spoken about in this video raise some serious doubts about the effectiveness of a dopamine detox as a treatment for addiction. You see, addiction is a psychological and physical inability to stop consuming a chemical, drug, activity or substance, even though it is causing psychological and physical harm. And according to the Addiction Center, there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all cure for addiction, and they should know because they are the actual experts in dealing with addiction. Addiction recovery, and bear in mind I say addiction recovery, not addiction cure, because there is no cure for it, there is only treatment and recovery. It can take years and years of sustained effort, and it's a constant battle every single day for somebody who suffers from addiction to not go back into relapse. This is much more than them having to go and spend some time in rehab. There is a lot more to it than that. We do not solve addiction by taking a short break away from whatever the substance or activity actually is. It's a battle that usually goes on for the rest of that person's life, and on a certain level, the idea that you can just sort out your addiction issues by just taking a day off from that harmful stimuli is almost insulting to the people that do have to deal with this on a day-to-day basis. But with that in mind, I don't want to be too harsh on the idea of a dopamine detox because there are parts of it that are actually pretty good. Journaling, for example, and reflecting on yourself and your mental state and how you got to where you are in life is super important, but I recommend that it be done on a lot more regular basis than once or twice a year when you do a dopamine detox. This is something that should be done quite regularly by keeping a journal or speaking to a counsellor or just conversing with friends and family on a deeper level. And the meditation and mindfulness aspect of the dopamine detox is also hugely important, and we should also bear in mind that mindfulness or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is a legitimate treatment for addiction and other mental health issues such as depression and anxiety. This is an actual legitimate science, but again, it has to be done much more often than just one day. It is a practice that needs to be done for sometimes years to get yourself up to a level where you want to be. These things take time, and ultimately every single one of us is so super complex that it's never just an issue of just changing something for one day and then we'll be fine for the rest of our lives or for the rest of the year or even the rest of the day, because anything can happen. And the fact is, again, the practitioners of the dopamine detox are correct. The brain is in fact overstimulated, but the idea of just taking a day or 2 days off of it is the rough equivalent of going to a fitness boot camp over the weekend and then wondering why you're still fat the week after. It's foolish to think that just changing something for a couple of days is going to affect you over the long term. It just doesn't work like that. So at this stage you're probably thinking, well Ben, if you're so smart, then what do you suggest? And I will tell you what I suggest. First off, don't overdo stuff. It's fine to do pleasurable activities. It's fine to do things that are fun as long as you don't do them too much. And I know that sometimes that is a big ask to do, especially when things become habitual, like social media, video games and things like that. I know because I have dealt with these issues in my life, and I'm sure a great number of people watching this video now have as well. So instead, what I suggest is to try and slowly eliminate bad habits from your life and replace them with better ones. Again, that sounds super easy, but that is the basic concept of habit replacement. You cannot just eliminate a bad habit like going on social media altogether, because that will create a vacuum that another bad habit is going to fill. Instead, what you want to do is when you eliminate a bad habit, or when you start to reduce a bad habit down, you want to build up a good habit alongside of it. So if you are reducing the amount of video games that you play, you might increase the amount of books that you read. Or if you want to eliminate the amount of time that you go on social media for validation, you might want to increase the amount of time that you spend in reflection or mindfulness meditation or something like that. And habit replacement is a hugely complex subject, which I will do a video on eventually, but for the purpose of this video, that is my understanding of how you can change your life over time. It's just small actions compounding as always. And of course, if you do find yourself showing signs of addiction to any substance, activity or anything like that, I would implore you to go and seek help. It does not necessarily have to be going to the doctor or going and finding a therapist. Just go and find something that works for you, whether that's a support group or just talking to someone that you trust, and make sure that you do get yourself the help that you need before it is too late. My final thoughts on the dopamine detox are this. First of all, we don't know what the long-term effects of overstimulation on the brain are. This is a relatively new thing that we're only now starting to do real long-term studies on, and it'll be a long time before we really understand the effects of things like the internet and social media and video games and pornography on the brain and its chemical structure. But with dopamine detoxes, what I will say is that the brain just isn't that sensitive. Just by abstaining from pleasurable things for a day, this will not reset your dopamine receptors in any way. It took a long time for them to get to the point where they are, if they are numb or if they are overstimulated, it's taken a long time for them to get there. And just taking a day off isn't going to solve that. These are serious issues which need to be dealt with in the right way. That being said, your levels of dopamine are probably fine. They are probably perfectly normal for somebody like you. And if you are unsure, you can go and see a doctor and find if there's anything that they can suggest. But I would argue that for 98% of people, you're going to be absolutely fine. You don't need a dopamine detox to get more motivated or to reduce your addiction to phones and social media and things like that. There are other pathways, more effective pathways. Ultimately, the brain is the most complex supercomputer known to man at this time, and the idea that you can reset it by just turning it off and turning it back on again is absolutely ludicrous, and that is what a dopamine detox essentially is. It's the equivalent of calling up your IT team and they answer by saying, "Hello, this is IT, have you tried turning it off and back on again?" Extremely frustrating and probably isn't going to work. We need to stop making people feel bad for being normal as well. It's normal to go through periods of lack of motivation, or it's normal to spend sometimes long amounts of time on social media for whatever reasons. These are normal things, so we also need to stop making people feel bad for that. I think the whole idea of dopamine detoxes can be summed up in this one tweet. Just because rich white dudes in Silicon Valley do it doesn't mean it's smart or makes sense at all. Dopamine fasting is, number 1, illogical, number 2, massively neuroscientifically ill-informed, and number 3, not worth media coverage. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate that it was quite long, but I do like to take my time and really explore these things. And I hope that you have found value in this video. Of course, if you think I'm wrong, please leave your thoughts and comments in the comment section below. I encourage discussion and I want to know what you think. So make sure that you do leave a comment if you have any questions or anything like that. Please make sure to leave a like on the video if you do find it useful, and make sure that you stick around for more content like this in the near future. I want to tackle more things and more self-help fads and parts of the self-help and self-improvement community that I believe are bad for people and potentially toxic in some areas. Next week I want to have a look at the whole alpha male situation, because that's something that doesn't seem to be going away, and I just want to kind of weigh in on that a little bit, and I think it'll be quite fun. I'll try and make the video a little bit shorter as well, but we'll see what happens. But otherwise, once again, thank you very much for making it all the way to the end of this video. Make sure that you do subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos very soon. Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to be talking about which sounds very, very cruel. Let's just keep... I can't watch any more of those really sad donkey documents. Now, number 4 is that this seems to be kind of... Well, you ride your little motivation... Well, you ride the motivational high... And the idea that you can reset it by just turning it off and turning it back on.